Hey guys, Jason, starting tonight with a question. What is the deadliest hurricane in United States history? Give you a second here to try to think of it. Did you say Hurricane Katrina? Incorrect. Did you go back to 1969 and say Hurricane Camille? Well, that's actually the strongest hurricane to ever hit the mainland United States. Completely, almost devastated and totally wiped out the Mississippi and Alabama Gulf Coast. But what if I told you that the deadliest hurricane in United States history goes even further back than that? You gotta go way back to 1900 to the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. And hurricanes weren't named back then, so that they basically just gave them whatever hurricane, whatever name that they could think of at the time. There was no National Weather Service sitting around naming hurricanes at that point. In fact, there was much of a coherent National Weather Service of any kind. Most of it was localized at that point. And so, now if you're wondering what the death count is on this one, it was never exactly nailed down because the destruction was so enormous, but estimates range anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000. Now, Hurricane Katrina killed somewhere a little under 2,000. But the fatality rate, and this is on Galveston Island, which of course is a barrier island off the Texas coast in the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, depending on what you call it these days. And this hurricane, by most estimates in modern day meteorology, made landfall in Galveston as a Category 4, with maximum sustained winds of somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 miles an hour. Now, this storm was some pretty serious shit, regardless of what you think, but it was a Category 4, and the reason why the death toll was so enormous was this storm landed with practically no warning whatsoever. The reason for that being, the Cuban Weather Service tried to notify us of this incoming storm because it ripped across the Cuban Isle. But we did not believe them. And life in Galveston went on as normal until the morning of September 8th, 1900, when it was just noticed that the wind was picking up a good bit. And before anybody knew it, by mid-afternoon, the island was engulfed in this hurricane. Maximum sustained winds of somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 miles an hour, and storm surge, which is the rise of sea level that comes with a hurricane pushing water on shore, was somewhere in the region of 25 feet. Now, at this point, Galveston was only 8 feet above sea level. So this is a rapid surging force of water that enveloped the entire island and the entire city, which this island city at the time had a population of 37,000, which at that time actually made it the largest city in Texas. Now, the impact of this storm would be enormous, historically changing. The entire history of Southeast Texas would change based on this particular storm, which killed 8,000 to 12,000 people unexpectedly and with little warning other than what was provided by our friends in Cuba. At the time, Cuba actually had the better weather system than the United States did. The U.S. was much more fragmented. The Cubans actually had the game down a lot better than we did. You could not make that argument today whatsoever. But I digress. This storm made history in all sorts of ways. My hometown is the present-day city of Katy, which is actually about 60 miles inland. And then you got that town, and you've also got the town of Brookshire, which is actually kind of a smaller town about 10 miles west of Katy. And those cities, being about 60 to 70 miles inland, were struck by this storm at Category 2 strength inland. Hurricanes typically weaken sharply once they hit the coast to make landfall and moved their way inland. But the eye passed over what is nowadays the old town of Katy, and Katy actually had that name by that point. Katie's original name was Cane Island, which is the name of the bayou branch that it was situated on. It gained the name of Katy because of the Katy Railroad, which was built, and the town was built around it. Katy Railroad is short for Missouri, Kansas, Texas. Somehow Missouri got the shaft on this one, and it became KT, as in Kansas and Texas. But this storm passed through those two towns and settlements with such amazing force that in Katy in particular, only 3 houses survived. And even to this day, those 3 houses are on the National Register of Historic Places. That's how significant this storm was. Now, as far as economically and the destruction of Galveston as a whole, what this did is it changed the entire history of southeastern Texas in that the city never fully rebuilt. People did return. The island did survive, and of course Galveston is still a city to this day. But most of the economic activity, the lion's share of it, and the commercial activity, as well as the transportation activity, moved inland about 50 miles to what is now Houston. And so Houston became what is now the nation's 4th largest city and the nation's 6th largest metropolitan area, all because of the hurricane of 1900. Minus the hurricane of 1900, who knows? Galveston might be the big metropolis these days, but instead it is part of the greater Houston metropolitan area, which suburban development has moved all the way into Galveston County. Galveston County, by the way, has both the island and a mainland segment. But Galveston eventually did become enveloped in the Houston metropolitan area, where it remains to this day. And suburbs such as League City, Friendswood, and such that'll make up that corridor between downtown Houston and the island city of Galveston. And also in that area, of course, is the NASA Johnson Space Center, which is also in that area between Houston and Galveston, which was built in the 1960s, pretty much in time for the Apollo missions. So that's halfway between Houston and Galveston. The Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, which actually was renamed the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center after his passing around in 1972. But that is also in that particular corridor. And Galveston itself, after the hurricane had passed through, was artificially raised by anywhere from 8 to 20 feet, depending on where on the island you were. And this also caused the building of what is now the Galveston seawall, which is about a 12-foot high concrete barrier on the southern facing beach of the island. This wall is such a marvel of engineering. It has never even come close to failing. And the Galveston seawall to this day is the crown jewel of engineering in Texas. Now, a couple of minor cracks did appear in it after Hurricane Ike hit in 2008. But for now, it stands as strong as ever. The seawall started being constructed in 1912. It took until about 1926 to finish. And this, of course, is after the few years between the commencing of the seawall construction and the hurricane itself. That is when the process of raising the island occurred. So to this day, most of the high points of Galveston Island sit at about 30 feet above sea level, whereas back when the hurricane struck, the highest point on the island was only 8 feet above sea level. And so a 20-foot storm surge completely enveloped the island, and in a storm surge, the water hits with immense force and is being pushed by the center of the hurricane towards land. And storm surge is probably what killed most of the people in this particular storm. There's a particularly tragic story of a Catholic orphanage where the nuns tied the children together with a rope to try to hold on to them. And unfortunately, all of the nuns and all of the children passed, likely due to storm surge striking the Catholic Church with such brute force that they had no chance. This, of course, is also in my previous episode of this series. Gordon Granger arrived in 1865 to free the slaves. This hurricane struck only 35 years later. So some individuals, a few thousand individuals likely survived through both events, and probably a couple thousand of them were probably lived through Juneteenth and were killed by the hurricane. There's no way of telling, of having a list of who fell into what category, because of course the destruction was so enormous that keeping track or counting was impossible, particularly with the systems as they stood in 1900. One thing that happened, even though the slaves had been freed at this point for 35 years, numerous African Americans, men, were at gunpoint forced to participate in the collection of bodies who had washed ashore. Now, this being even after they had been made free, these days would constitute a federal crime. But in 1900 it didn't. These men got an unlimited supply of whiskey just to soothe the pain from having to endure this ghastly job. And other thing that happened in the process of this, in an effort to get rid of the bodies, they put some of them on boats and then dumped them into the Gulf. Unfortunately, several days later, many of them washed back on shore, which then led them to have to figure out another way to get rid of them. Unfortunately for these people, they did not have the wood chipper from the movie Fargo at this point. Because if they did, I'm sure that would have been an option. So instead, what they did was they put a lot of them on pyres of wood and burnt them on what is now, the modern day version of a funeral pyre. So they had to dispose of bodies that way, and therefore most of them were never identified. So we just never know, we never knew how many exactly perished in this storm and how many were survivors of both, who were both the survivor of Juneteenth in 1865 and then victims of the hurricane 35 years later. So there it is, folks, the story of the most fatal hurricane in the history of the United States. It's not Hurricane Katrina, it's not Hurricane Camille, it's not even Hurricane Andrew in Florida in 1989. It is the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. I'll be back tomorrow. I don't know if I'm trying not to keep it as ghastly this time around, because I'm sure most of you don't like to watch my episodes and throw up. But that said, I will check in with you guys tomorrow with another episode, and I'll be back with more What If I Told You. This is Jason. Enjoy your Thursday night. Peace out, homies.